Hello! Welcome back to Beat Goblin. This is going on the second channel, not because it's off topic, which is normally the reason stuff goes on this channel, but because it's anticlimactic and a bit scatterbrained. So bear with me on our journey to nowhere in particular. Basically, the premise of this video is just some final thoughts and beats on the SP-404. I have it on loan, so I am sending it back, and just not really vibing with it. So it's of no fault of its own. At first glance, this thing is ticking all the boxes. A relentless box ticker, even. And it's not bad gear, it's just not for me. And I've got some kind of scattered thoughts on why I think that might be, but first, let's get into making a few beats, starting off with some generic lo-fi. Take it away past itself. I have a bit of a confession to make. I haven't used the SP-404 Mark II much since I got it. Part of that is just I got really busy and overwhelmed, and part of it is I just didn't really feel like it. So I'm on a mission to love the SP-404 Mark II, or at least to try to learn to. This will be a little bit of a different format because I'm starting here. I don't know where this is necessarily going to end up, but I've been spending some time off camera making beats with it in the past couple of days, and here are my findings so far. So the main way I've been engaging with it is making a fairly simple, short little beat, and then resampling that with some effects and playing with the time and pitch, and then basically calling it a day. That's where I'm at so far. Something like this. Or maybe this. And if I dive into the patterns, I can show you what these sounded like originally. Played a little faster. General lack of quantization, or this. And then my go-to has been turning on one of the multi-effects, often one of the vinyl or tape sims. I've been very much vibing on the cassette sim. Not that one. That's just a good time. Or maybe we can crank up the age on that tape a bit. Similar deal with the vinyl sim. So, like in the case of this, I will resample the whole pattern onto a pad with those multi-effects active. And then, stop that, I can go in and slow it down. I think it worked a little better on this one where I ran it through the vinyl sim, and just take it down a semitone. Check out the difference. That's much more of a vibe to me. And then there's a part where it can be taken too far, depending on the sample. And playing this stuff in was super simple as well. It's just having a bunch of my samples loaded into the pads and just sitting on the couch kind of with no goal and just noodling around. Recording stuff with a combination of no quantization and some quantization. Hopefully you get the idea. And then I've got all of these little melodic chops to work with. And so I'll just develop a drum beat, develop a little sample chop over the top of it, add some extra little pieces for flavor, resample it with effects, pitch it down a bit, and then what? That's kind of it. Everything is baked into this one sample, so that's my beat. But I know a lot of people use the SP-404 for live performance type stuff. So obviously there's somewhere more to go from here. I'm trying to find out what that is, but also if this ends with just Gabe makes more beats and calls it a day, manage your expectations. And we are back to the present day. After that session, I spent some more time with this thing, loaded on the latest firmware, loaded on some new sounds, just sat on my bed over there and doodled out a little synthwave beat. I thought I would take it in a different direction than the kind of expected lo-fi stuff, but still do some sample trapping in the process. So let's get into that next. All right, so you've heard this already in the intro, but it actually goes a bit further. A tad busy, perhaps, but it was fun to make. So this is something I got from Splice, and it's pitched down a good bit. And it's nice, but I think this made it a lot more of a vibe. So I chopped this up using the built-in chopping feature, and here's what that sounds like. So that's our foundation. So we're going for somewhere between synthwave and vaporwave here. Then stack on some drums. By the way, can I mention one actual annoyance with this thing? A lot of this video has been me kind of dancing around the fact that I just don't personally vibe with the workflow of this, but I don't really dislike it and I have no real complaints. Here's my one real complaint is file formats, because I, like any music producer around my age, went on Splice, downloaded a bunch of stuff, and just dumped all the WAV files onto the SD card, and none of them would load. And it turns out that this thing only accepts very particular formats of WAV files. Like it has to be, if I recall correctly, the right bitrate and all that kind of stuff. So that's an extra step that you have to do. I believe if you use the software that is built for the 404, it'll do that conversion when you import stuff. If not, you have to do that conversion yourself. I did it with Reaper because it can do batch converting of files to various formats. So that was fine, but that's something that's good to know about going in, because I had several very frustrating minutes trying to load sounds onto these pads and none of them working. Anyway, once I got that working, I've got multiple kicks that I'm switching between. I've got some hi-hats, tom, and with these hi-hats, you can go shift 16 velocity. And this is basically your 16 levels. Then from these drums, we move on to the next bank, which has a bunch of synth one shots in it. I did try to be fairly organized about how I loaded sounds onto this thing. So bank A is drum one shots, bank B is a bunch of synth one shots. I've got a bank for breaks chops that I haven't really developed into anything. Some more drums, samples to chop, stop that. And hopefully you get the idea. I found that helpful personally to be able to organize stuff deliberately into banks, and there are multiple ways you could go about that. I've kind of organized stuff by type of instrument. Regardless, this self-made little synth stab, and in this case, I'm just playing something monophonic and chromatic. That's the same for all of the synth parts in this, by the way. I have not made adequate use of the polyphony. This is sampled from my Roland JU06A. A lot of Roland today, obviously. And that works fine for a main lead. Ideally, I would have liked to be able to process that individual part a bit more. You could if you did more resampling, but in this case, I like how punchy the whole part sounds. Or if I go into pattern select and turn on some effects, everything gets kind of smushed together, and I think that works too. So with all that out of the way, I'm actually having trouble on putting my finger on why I'm having a hard time loving the SP-404, because it does a lot of the stuff that I would want it to. It's portable, it's got sample chopping, stereo sampling, great effects, but every time I would pick it up, it was out of a sense of obligation. Like, hey, I've got this thing for a limited amount of time, I guess I should be using it. And I'm having a hard time putting my finger on why. But a couple of potential reasons are, for one thing, it's a very resampling based device, and resampling in a way that has everything get baked together. And so my workflow very often relies heavily on exporting or somehow extracting individual tracks of a project and working with them in post, getting to process them to approach something more polished. And that's pretty antithetical to at least the workflow that the 404 seems to try to funnel you into. And I think that's a big reason why I had trouble kind of committing to the bit on this thing, so to speak, because I would always feel like any creativity I poured into this thing would just be kind of going into a locked little box where I couldn't do anything with it once I finished making a beat on here, which of course is not necessarily true. Like, people have made entire sets on this thing. It's just not a workflow that I found very conducive to the way that my brain likes to work on music. I think some of that is probably due to the stuff that I'm used to using, but I think some of it is a little more like inherent to just how my brain works. Like, when I first got into music production, I started on FL Studio and it never really clicked. And then I switched to Logic and then Reaper, and those make intuitively a lot more sense to me. So I think this is just one of those cases where Roland's owned MC101 or the Innovation Circuits or the MPC1 make more sense to me, and this makes less sense to me, even though I understand a lot of the features. Plus, I usually like to use a bit more processing on individual tracks, and this seems to have a bit more of an emphasis on putting processing globally, which personally, for my own purposes, I find a little less useful, and the results just tend to be a bit dustier sounding than I am usually going for. And I think we all have our kind of jank and inconvenience and menu diving and workarounds that we are willing to accept, and that's going to vary from person to person. Like I mentioned, Roland's MC101, a famously fiddly and menu divey device that I freaking adore. That has the workflow trade-offs that I am willing to accept, whereas this one has workflow trade-offs that I'm less willing to accept. And maybe that would go away with time, and if this was my only music production device, I could absolutely make it work. But I've got other stuff I prefer more, so it was time to send this back to the folks that loaned it to me over at Zounds and call it a day. Regardless, if you'd like some more beat making, I've got you covered with these videos up over here. Just punch myself in the face. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. 1 second.